Hello, and welcome back. We're going to concentrate now on our reversible cell injury. And from the last video, hydropic swelling is one of those types of reversible injury, okay? Now with each of these, with the hydropic swelling and the next one I'll talk about the intracellular accumulations, if things persist too long, you are going to have the cell damage be such that it can't be reversed, okay? But hydropic swelling is due to water accumulation within the cell, okay? Now, most often, now there can be other mechanisms, but we're going to just focus on one for this particular class. Is a failure of the sodium-potassium pump, okay? Because one of the things that hopefully you also remember from A&P is that water tends to follow sodium. So if you aren't able to remove sodium from the inside of the cell, and sodium concentration is higher within the cell, water is going to move into that cell, okay? Now, typically one reason for the sodium-potassium pump failure can be a lack of ATP, okay? Because this particular process, moving sodium and potassium, in this case you're moving against the normal concentration gradient, so it requires the input of energy. That energy is going to come from ATP, all right? There can be different reasons for why the cell isn't making ATP, all right? Typically, we're talking a malfunction in mitochondria, all right? Maybe that cell membrane on the mitochondria breaks open, all right? If that happens, then it's going to dump its contents into the cell, and you aren't going to get ATP made at the level that it needs to be, all right? That's just one reason. It's not exclusive. There can be others, okay? But typically what you're going to see with hydropic swelling, and this is going to be at a histological level. All right, so if you're looking at the cell histology, the cell is going to be enlarged because of the increase of water moving in. It's going to look kind of pale. Again, that's because of the water. All right, and you're going to see dilations of the organelles. Again, because you've got more water in a place than it normally would, okay? So getting that, having that additional water in there can be one reason that the mitochondria malfunction. These two kind of play on one another, all right? But hydropic swelling, water accumulation. Now, if that water is removed, then that is reversible. That cell will go back to functioning normal. If it's not, if it continues into being persistent, you risk rupturing cell membranes, organelle membranes. That then brings things into irreversible kinds of damage. All right. Our second one is going to be the intracellular accumulations. Okay? Now, the intracellular accumulations can be what we call endogenous. So normal cellular components. Things like proteins can accumulate because maybe there's an enzyme that's lacking that doesn't break down the protein. Sugar can accumulate. Lipids or fats can accumulate. So these are things that are part of the normal cell process. You just end up getting more of them within the cell than typically there should be. And there can be a variety of mechanisms for the accumulation of these kinds of products. Sugar in particular, if somebody is diabetic and can't process the sugar from the foods they're taking in, that sugar will accumulate within the cell, okay? And that can also lead to hydropic swelling because the increased sugar is going to bring in more water to the cell, okay? So sometimes these two can be linked. They don't always have to be, though, all right? That's just one example. Lipids, when we get to Patho 2, you'll learn about fatty liver disease. So the accumulation of fat in the hepatocytes results in the liver not being able to function normally, okay? So essentially things that are normally made by the cell accumulate at high levels. And that's the key there. You've got high levels of things that are normally made. You can also have things that are exogenous, or from outside the cell, okay? These can be things that are toxic. Lead can accumulate, that's one. You can have accumulation of other environmental. Sorry, I had trouble coming up with that word for some reason. Environmental substances. You know, inhaling coal particles can result in things like black lung. That would be an intracellular accumulation that's resulted from something environmental. Okay? So things can be endogenous, they can be exogenous. Inside the cell, outside the cell. I should also mention inside the cell, another one that'll come up later. Bilirubin is another essentially byproduct of the breakdown of hemoglobin. Bilirubin can accumulate within the cells. This is a yellow pigment. And that can lead to jaundice in particular, okay? But that would be another endogenous type of accumulation. It's something that's normally made within the cell. It just isn't broken down normally, so it accumulates. You can also have proteins, maybe that are misfolded. And I think the example I've got in your notes is Hurler syndrome. Okay? I tend to give you examples. These are not exhaustive examples, but I just want you to have an idea of how things can accumulate into the cell and result in pathologies. Okay? Now, in this case, Hurler syndrome, it's a defect in mucopolysaccharides, and those mucopolysaccharides, when they accumulate, cause damage within the cell, typically causes some mental retardation associated with it, okay? This one in particular, have it as protein. It's really a glycoprotein, all right? But that Hurler syndrome has to do with the lysozyme not functioning correctly, okay? Lysozymes within the cell can be part of the process for disposing of either proteins or glycoproteins that aren't supposed to be there, aren't folded properly, aren't functioning properly, okay? But that's just one example. And I do have one other example with exogenous that I should mention. Tattoos are considered an intracellular accumulation. In this case, of ink in skin cells. All right. The skin cells aren't able to remove that ink. That's what results in the pigmentation associated with the tattoo. Okay. So again, that can be just another example of an intracellular accumulation. Now, if it's reversible, we're talking about the water imbalance gets corrected. If it's reversible with intracellular accumulations, you're talking about restoring whatever is out of whack, either with the endogenous or exogenous accumulation. If it doesn't, okay, and it goes into being persistent, all right, that persistent accumulation, whether hydropic swelling or the accumulation, results in a change to the cell. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video, but just to kind of give you a preview, you can have things like atrophy as an adaptation. You can have hypertrophy. Okay, atrophy means the cells get smaller. Hypertrophy means they get bigger. Okay, you can also have hyperplasia or metaplasia. Now, this type of change tends to be associated with cancer. Cancer is another topic we will get to this term. I should also put in here dysplasia. Also tends to be associated with cancers, okay? So you can have changes that'll happen if now we go into a persistent type of cell injury, all right? Reversible, cell goes back to functioning normally or relatively normal. Persistent, now the cell may change how it works. All right. Thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.